So this is a surprise podcast. Nigel didn't know he was going to be doing this, but I figured it would be a really interesting topic today to talk about the dreaded Thanksgiving dinner discussions that anybody in crypto ends up having with their family.
Oh god.
And the ways, and not necessarily how to avoid it, but how to understand how to deal with them.
I think it's hard enough to talk to people who actually do have some idea of what they're talking about. I don't know if it would be harder or easier to talk to somebody who doesn't know anything. Because those people have nothing but emotional predisposition based on the people that they listen to. They don't have any technical background to leverage in your explanations.
Yeah, I actually have a pretty hilarious story. So every year for Thanksgiving, my extended family from my mom's side, usually my uncle Terry and his wife, and maybe a few others would come over and we'd all sit down and have those dinners together. And he knew for the longest time that I've been into Bitcoin and other crypto. And it wasn't last year or the previous year. It was I'd say about 2 or 3 years ago, and we started having these discussions around, cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. And the first thing he brought up was tulips. Because and I don't know if you know the analogy here, but
We're not talking about flowers.
no, well, no, we are talking about flowers
We are
because
talking about flowers.
we are because back in the day, and you may not know this, but there was I guess you could call it kind of like a short squeeze or a major trend in was wherever the Holland.
Suburban homekeeping?
Yeah, no, yeah, that tulips became this insanely expensive commodity.
Wait, I didn't know
And
about this.
no, he did.
Was I too young for this, or was I just not paying attention to flowers?
No, well, no, this was hundreds of years ago.
Okay.
So you're
So I was
definitely
definitely
know
too
this. Yeah. So what happened is it became some kind of huge, insane fad to the point where you could trade a tulip for a house, right?
like
It was
pineapple levels of absurdity.
Yeah,
What?
absolutely pineapple levels of uncertainty. So it kind of became this meme that whenever there is some kind of trend where some kind of commodity's price increases insanely, and then
The
they
inflated value.
right, inflated value, and then drops off suddenly, they started going, "Oh, well, it's just like the tulips." Just
When
like
everyone realizes suddenly that it is in fact just a flower. And they
right,
can
exactly. They're
grow
like,
it themselves.
"Oh, right. Yeah."
God.
But then the Dutch had a monopoly on it, and
Mhm.
they used that monopoly very well. So it was a very controlled commodity until people were like, "Oh yeah, I'm just gonna steal a bunch of these bulbs and I'll be fine." So that was the feeling that or the impression that he had of Bitcoin specifically, but crypto in general, because he didn't understand the inherent value of it. And so he would be all these things.
Well, I mean, but inherent value aside, the exact, and I think I've said this before, but the exact same argument can be made about any money you have.
Sure.
Any money could be compared to tulips because all it takes is someone to wake up one day and be like, wait a minute, it's just a piece of metal. It's just a piece of paper. It's just an agreement. It's just a number. It's just like a few ones and zeros in a computer. Like, it's just whatever it is. It's not water. It's not like
Well,
carbon
don't
based
say that because
food fuel.
Nestle has definitely made some good money off of water.
Fair enough. But you know what I mean? Like like humans need water to survive. If you can lock up the water is a very, very leverageable money kind of a thing. It has inherent value because without it, we die, you know?
Yeah,
Same
sure.
thing goes for carbohydrates or like some sort of a caloric battery of any kind. It has an inherent value to a living being where a trade commodity or like any kind of money that you use as a sort of an exchange medium for the things that we need, not just want, but need, does not have any inherent value except that which we assign to it. So, money of any kind, unless it is like literally the thing that you need to live, is just tulips. If you want to like be really like circumspect and existential about it. So like whenever people make that argument about, oh, crypto's just ones and zeros and blah blah blah, and I'm like, well, so is everything. if
Right.
you really want, if you really think about it. And it's like, well, gold is more useful than like cotton paper, which is what US money is made of. Maybe the US Treasury would rather I didn't tell you that. That's why it comes out in the wash. It doesn't get destroyed in the washing
Yep.
machine. It's
Yep.
because it's cloth, not paper. Well, it is
Right.
paper, but it's like more like cloth than it is like paper in that regard. But yeah, so it's like that argument always feels kind of funny to me. I think that there are other arguments, but that one in particular feels really nonsensical.
Yeah,
Sorry, I
that's
interrupted you
no,
to
no,
go
no,
off on
no,
that
it's fine.
tangent.
You're very much echoing my thoughts, but it does come with a level of really not knowing the values or everything that goes into that kind of thing. So then, not this last Thanksgiving, but the previous Thanksgiving, Bitcoin had made it up to $97,000, right? And so my uncle came over to me and then patted it on the back and he said, "You know what? You were right." And I was like, "Yeah, yeah. Oh,
He
I
crouched down in the middle of the kitchen floor then and
no,
there.
yeah." He raised up his hands and then it was a golden Bitcoin. No, but then this last Thanksgiving, Bitcoin had, been down to like $60,000. So that he didn't make it to this last one, but I know that if we'd had that conversation, he'd be like, "Yeah, so what happened there?"
It's creeping down. Well, the same thing that happens to so I remember I saw a video when I was learning about cryptocurrency early on. I saw this video that was describing the patterns that we see with the crypto market, and it was comparing them to the patterns that we saw with the US dollar when the US dollar was new. Because, fun fact, we didn't always have the US dollar since the year zero. It started sometime after the United States started. So it's, as currencies go, it's relatively new compared to a lot of them that are out there. And I think the euro is then also considerably newer than that. But we used to use like the pound or I don't know, tobacco leaves, stuff like
Yeah.
that when we were colonies. Promissory notes and things like that were a lot more common. Barter was a lot more common, stuff like that. But anyway, the point being that when the US dollar was fairly new, it had a lot of spikes in relative value to the far more stable pound. And that's really the thing, is that the value of the currency itself is not unstable necessarily. It's that it's unstable relative to the thing that is stable. That might sound like just words that don't make sense. And let me see if I can come up with a better way to explain what I mean. What I mean is basically that the thing itself, because the currencies themselves do not have inherent value, they are made up. So when people's emotions are volatile, people may decide that they don't like the new thing that's made up very much, right?
Right.
But that doesn't change the fact that it is still valueless and that the other thing that they're comparing it to is also valueless. Like their inherent values never change because they don't mean anything, right? That's completely immutable and nothing will ever change that, right?
But also
But
an irrelevant point.
their comparative well, yeah, it is basically an irrelevant point, but like their comparative value to one another is entirely emotionally based. But it's emotionally based in a landscape that is like the economy of comparative value is an economy of emotion, essentially. If people get nervous about something, that's just like the greed fear index thing that you can look up online and you see a little meter that tells you,
Yep.
are investors generally feeling greedy or are they generally feeling nervous? And it can do a pretty good job of telling you, like, hey, is the thing that's sort of new, like shaky, or is it doing well compared to the thing that we've decided is stable? And we've decided that the US dollar is the benchmark stable thing, the stable value, and that all of the cryptocurrencies are whatever they are. But if tomorrow we just decided that cryptocurrency was the gold standard of all value, and that the US dollar was the thing that we were speculating on, the US dollar would look wild. It'd be going up and down all over the fucking place. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? If we
No, I think it would
decided the
probably go
Bitcoin's
down.
value
I think it
was
would go down a
stable.
lot more.
Well, but you know what I mean? Like we decide that the US dollar is one and that
Right.
Bitcoin is going all the time. But if we decided that Bitcoin was one and the US dollar would look like it was going up all over the place. Like it's entirely a mental framing. Now, that mental framing is backed up by the fact that we use the US dollar for everything. And the global agreement is that the US dollar is that thing. But if everybody woke up tomorrow and decided that it was Bitcoin was it, then the US dollar would look really shaky, you know?
Well, I think they all look shaky relatively because the value of either or is entirely dependent on the current events and what is transpiring. Is the US going to maintain the petrodollar supremacy over BRICS? If so, then dollar go up. Is the US going to print out trillions of dollars to pay for all these different programs it wants to do? Dollar value go down. Bitcoin, is the Clarity Act going to pass and then suddenly make it much more business friendly for people to do business with crypto? Value go up. Is one country going to make Bitcoin illegal? Value of Bitcoin go down. So
Is somebody going to put out a popular YouTube video that's mean about it?
right, yeah.
I mean, and that's really, I think that's probably one of the best arguments, in my opinion, about the issue with cryptocurrency is because it is new, it is easily manipulated by people saying some bullshit. But the point being that if somebody with 1 million subscribers on YouTube can make a video that says, "Oh my God, Bitcoin is doomed," and then a ton of people sell Bitcoin, and then the value of Bitcoin gets absolutely dumpstered because some guy woke up and chose violence. And then he was like, hey, I'm going to buy that, dude. I think that one of the better arguments against new currency creation is largely born out of social media. And like people used to be able to do this by, I will write an article in the New York Times and then people will know how I feel about it. And if you were a notable politician of the time or a notable figure of some other kind, like the head of a very popular business or whatever, people would listen to you maybe and would do what you said, or they would allow you to manipulate the markets through social engineering. Now that we live in a post Facebook, Twitter, and et cetera world, there is a more potent ability for someone with a popular social media account to manipulate the markets in a favorable situation to themselves and to ruin other people's lives. It allows people to consolidate wealth in sort of unfair ways. It allows people to engineer markets, and that is maybe a better argument against creating new currencies than many of the ones that I've heard is that in the social media and technology world that we live in, it's that much more possible for people to play unfairly, right? Where for BC used to travel at the speed of a horse, and now that has gotten so, that environment doesn't exist anymore. Now we live in a place where people can be like, smash like and subscribe and I'll take all your money, like
Yeah, well, I think even that is limited based on scope and scale. So, I mean, if you have every influencer on YouTube and on Twitter and politicians saying a thing, that could probably move the price of Bitcoin a certain amount. But if you have one guy with 1 million followers, like Bitcoin has been around for so long, it would be difficult because even then that could get lost in the noise. Now, if you're talking about a much like a currency that just came out like Bob's coin, that
right.
specifically
I think that
could get
Bitcoin at this stage, Bitcoin is a little more stable than it was early. But you look at any of a number of shitcoins, and it all it takes is like one guy to be like, "Oh my God, this is the coolest thing ever," and everyone, look at
that's
any
true.
of the rug pull scam shitcoins. It's all been like one influencer's like, "I've released my new crypto," and you're all gonna buy it. I mean, and I know that a lot of people will not like to hear this, but that's Haktua coin, that's Trump coin, like
Yes,
that's all of
100%.
these kinds of things is just somebody who puts their face on a coin and says, buy it because you love me, or buy it because you trust me, whatever it is, and then people do it, and then that person says, yoink, thank you
Yep.
for your hard-earned dollars. And it's an engine that allows people to consolidate money. And that's a thing that a lot of people have pointed to as a problem in modern economics. So I think that That's a decent argument for me. Like, I hear if I hear somebody say that, I'm like, I hear you. That is a problem with creating new currencies. But I think that that would be a problem with any new currency. But
Well, and
crypto's bane in that conversation is that it's so easy to make one. Anyone can make one, in theory.
right, but what I would say to that is that, cryptos aren't just a currency per se, and that they are also in either, like, an organization or a business venture.
They're
And
kind
that
of more, correct me if I'm wrong, they're a little more like shares than they are like
Yes.
dollars.
Right.
Yeah.
I'd say
No,
that.
actually, no. Okay, here's a question.
Mhm.
Stocks are shares of a given company, the divided pieces of ownership of a given company, right?
Right.
Would you consider dollars or any fiat currency to be effectively shares of a given government?
Well, ours would be shares of our government's debt.
Well, I mean, yeah, I suppose.
Specifically.
But I mean, and I know that they wouldn't necessarily frame that way. Like, you couldn't go to the US government and say, hey, I have I have 51% market share of the US dollar. I own the government and it does what I say now. And I know that it doesn't say in law that is the case, but it is effectively how it works.
It does because those people who have a significant amount of money spend that money in order to influence said politicians or government officials in order to get their way. So it's not
Right.
just the ownership because people could have a lot of money and not use it to affect the direction of the government, but those that want to can't.
Absolutely can. And so with cryptocurrency, you could have market share and you could choose not to use it that way if you wanted to.
Depending on the currency, because so like Bitcoin, owning more Bitcoin means absolutely nothing with the direction that the crypto goes. It means
But if you're
nothing.
owning, like, say, I don't know, a friend of mine was like tomato coin. So you have shares in some sort of like farmers market organization or whatever.
Right.
This was his like brainchild. If you own like 51% of tomato coin, suddenly you get to kind of rule the roost and make executive decisions about the
It
way that engine runs in theory.
right, but that would depend on if the coin,
Is government
let I
governance
yes, is equated to governance and voting rights on the direction of whatever proposals may come up. Yes.
right. And so the funny thing though that is Bitcoin's system is somewhat immutable. It is working the way it's working and it's not going to change in theory, right?
I mean, it'll be upgraded. It'll be made more secure and more useful over
So
time, but
who gets to
it's
do that though? Who gets to
that would
choose?
be it's kinda it has to be like 95% consensus between the core developers, the miners, and the wallet holders. Like, everybody kind of has to agree to use the chain with the upgrades as written.
Okay. And so holding more Bitcoin does not change how much voting power you have in making that decision.
Correct. Makes
Cool.
0 difference.
Good. So in that case, it's very much like unanimous democratic agreement.
Pretty much. I would say it's still more like a constitutional republic because the core
Okay.
code of Bitcoin is like the Constitution. And then the devs and the miners have to abide by that Constitution or else the whole thing falls.
Right. So what I would wonder then, because in those coins, in those chains that are like kind of built around governance of a given company or system or something like that, those things have that written in. Like that's part of the deal. That's part of the way that the
Maybe.
thing is set up.
It depends because there are centralized cryptocurrencies where the devs are still in control of it, and then they would control which proposals maybe would go out to the community. So there would still be a level
Oh,
of centralization with them, or
so
there's
that's
a
like
full
I'm God and I'm
times.
benevolently choosing to
Right.
allow my people to vote.
Correct. Benevolent dictatorship
Okay.
kind of a deal.
So there are those situations like that.
Sure.
But interestingly enough, the US dollar has nothing like that written into it, right? But
Right.
because the people who run the government are people who also agree along with everyone else on the value of the money that they issue.
Well, the Federal Reserve issues the currency.
Right, right. But
which is
I'm sort of
not
referring to
federal
the
or
U.S.
part of the
government
government.
as a giant brain in the sky in this case,
Yeah,
but
they get to grow.
it's run by worker bees that happen to be people who also are part of the broad global agreement that money issued by the U.S. is valuable. And
Mhm.
because they are part of that agreement, they are inherently corruptible. So when people
Oh, sure.
consolidate a large portion of the currency, even though there's nothing written into the Constitution, there's nothing written into the law, it is just part of the math and the nature of human beings that the US dollar functions like a governance-based crypto, in that if you have enough of it, you get to heavily influence choices made in governance. And,
I'd
it's
say
not
it's
that you get a vote, it's that
right.
you get to push and pull on who does get a vote.
Right, yeah, and it's
Because
so convoluted
republic
because
shenanigans, you know?
yeah, because you do have the people in government who are making those choices as to how much money gets borrowed, and there's some influence of those people in the government on the Federal Reserve, who's in charge of the Federal Reserve, who's going to be changing what rates the interest rates are at a given period of time. And then you also have the sub banks that operate under that and the financial institutions, and then you have the rich, the people with lots of money in companies that all have these large coffers, and they want to. And so it's this weird organism that has all these different organelles that have the that are pulling every which way for the resources, and
Mm.
they have different motivations. So you can't really nail it down to one thing very simply, but all of them working together exert influence on how the currency moves.
Yeah, I think that my reason for bringing this up, though, is less about trying to make some sort of, like, highly intellectual point, but more just to say, like, the argument that fiat currency is somehow so much more, like, pure and clean than crypto, which is, like, dirty and crime-ridden and all of this, it's like, fiat currency is currency at its core, and currency having value inherently begets this system that is at least honestly addressed in a lot of crypto chains,
It
you know what I mean?
Yes, it is
And honestly
much more
addressed, it was
simple.
regulated, you
Yeah,
know?
it is highly yeah, you could easily say it's highly regulated, depending on the crypto to a degree, and it is very easily traceable, and you can understand very simply how those mechanisms work.
Because I think the difference between fiat and crypto at this point is that if somebody decides, "Hey, I'm definitely not Elon Musk, and I have septillions of dollars," or whatever we're at now, and I go to my local tax man. No, I go to whoever writes the tax code and I say, hey, I want you to write an exception in for anyone who has over X amount of money, or anyone whose last name is Musk. I mean, definitely not Musk,
Right.
or anyone to get very, very dystopian. I want you to write in tax exceptions for anyone with blonde hair and blue eyes, you know?
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, you also have to make
Things
sure
could get
you
very
understand.
sinister, and I'm being outrageous here
Sure.
intentionally.
But you
Um,
also have to make the delineation between, do they have money, or do they have lots of money, or do they have lots of assets, or is there some kind of ratio between the 2? Because there is a big difference,
Right.
and a lot of
Well,
a
if I
lot of
have lots of
lawmakers.
assets, I can make lots of promises, which are basically the same thing as money when you have that much of it, you
Right.
know?
So the one issue that really irks me is like people like Elizabeth Warren, who, if you know anything about her and her relationship to crypto, she's very, very, very dishonest, like incredibly dishonest.
I knew a little bit about Elizabeth Warren. I've heard a little bit about her, sordid history with crypto.
Right. So she's very, I would say,
Not much.
economically illiterate, or at least she's
Well, I
literate in
don't think she's
one
necessarily economically illiterate. I think that Elizabeth Warren, from what I could glean through her various moments in the spotlight over the years, I don't think she's necessarily, like, got
well,
any I didn't have a read on her that she had any agenda other than saying whatever she thought the largest portion of her base wanted to hear from her at any given time.
So that would go it's either illiterate or malevolent, but let me back up
I
my
think she was just
yeah.
kind of going with the flow on a lot of stuff, and a lot of like anti-crypto sentiment was very popular in her base, right? So I've heard a lot of people say that think she's like the devil and stuff. I don't know if I think I buy that, but I do think that she was guilty of kind of just like nodding and smiling to her crowd. Well,
Well, it was a lot more than that because the legislation
again, that's
is
what
yeah,
I've seen
right.
over the
The
years, and I
the
haven't paid that
the
much
type
attention to her. I'll be
yeah,
honest.
the type of legislation she was pushing would have been extremely crippling to any kind of progress regarding crypto. I mean, I just basically to make it non-usable, really. And the other schemes that she's come up with would have been very financially destructive to the entire US economy, and I'll explain why. So, one of her things that she wanted to do was there's this thing, tax rich. I get it. I understand it. But what she wanted to do was to tax people on the unrealized value of their assets. So, as unrealized gains. So, if you bought something at $10 and it rose to $100 and you still hold it, you haven't sold it for a profit, you'd be taxed on the value of that
I
increase.
have I have something to contribute to that subject specific,
I will.
and I know
Let
we've
me
talked about this in the past.
I'll let you get to it. Let me just finish the
Yeah,
story
yeah,
and then
yeah.
I'll let you get to that. So the deal here is that obviously Musk becomes a big target, and again, I can understand that there's clearly a lot of not above board things that he's done, but this goes for all the big companies in the world where you have somebody like Bezos or one of those guys.
That is a low reading boat, as we
I know.
say.
I know. Or anybody with large amounts of assets in these stocks. So the way it would have worked is that, okay, you have let's say a 10% tax. Let's just
Mhm.
throw that. I think that was probably what the case was, but yeah, any percent, but let's say 10% on the gains or the assets. No, I think it was just the assets that
So if you
people
did
hold.
that and someone held the thing while it went up while it spiked in value unrealized,
Yes.
they get taxed on it that tax year. And if they continue to hold it until the next year when it plummeted, would the government end up owing
Nope.
back?
No. No.
So you can't get untaxed for unrealized losses then.
Nope. Yeah, that's right. That's right. So here's the kicker though. So they have these assets and they have to pay 10% on those assets that they hold. So how do you get the money for the assets that you hold? You sell those assets. So if you're Elon Musk, if you're Jeff Bezos, if you're whichever, Bill Gates and Microsoft, and you have to pay 10% on the value of your assets, that means you have to sell at least 10% of your assets, what could be millions of shares of whichever company you're talking about. And what happens when the market is suddenly flooded with millions of shares?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Shit plummets real
yeah,
fast.
exactly. The entire value of the companies plummet, and this would happen every single year because they would have to be taxed every single year on the value of those assets. And who holds those assets other than those people? People with retirement funds.
Yeah,
E
that would be.
Everybody's retirement funds would be completely wiped out because tax the rich. It's
And
not
this is
that
why I
taxing the
think
rich
that
is a
she
bad
would have
thing,
been
though.
pushing something like this because of her base.
Right.
Because her base are not economists. Her base are
Well, even economists is a really, really washy word because anybody can be an
economists or
economist.
economically people with economics or
Literacy. Yeah,
even like
yeah, yeah.
an economics class or even a stats class in college.
Right.
Like people with the head for this type of stuff, right? Her base would be people who have an emotional compulsion to punish the people that they perceive to be wronging them. And I think it's very fair to say that people like X, Y, and Z top 10 billionaires in the US, yeah, they're heavily responsible for a lot of anyone in the 99%, any one of the the economic grievances that they're experiencing. The wealth consolidation is somewhat inexcusable. Now, there isn't a heck of a lot that you can do about the nature of numbers here, where if you assign value to a thing and someone gets more of that thing has value, and they're able to leverage that value to get more things to generate more value. Rich just get richer. That is how it works. What's a problem is when your government assists them in
Mhm.
getting richer. The government should be dampening that pattern. That pattern should exist. You can't make it not exist. If the rich get poorer, there are no rich, and then you have total equilibrium, and that is communism. And we all know that that doesn't function well because people are greedy. So the rich do have to get richer, but the government needs to make it so that the pattern of rich get richer is slowed enough that rich can't get richer faster than the human lifespan is, faster than a human lifespan can be reasonable. So if a person can't live more than about 50 years of economic significance, let's say, in theory, you don't start working until you're like, or you don't start getting to be a billionaire until you're maybe 30, hopefully. If you're a billionaire when you're 15, you probably inherited. But say you become a billionaire at 30 and you live to 70. That's the average lifespan of a man in this country. Jesus. I think it was 68 actually, which is terrible. But say you live to 70 on average. But if you're a billionaire, you probably live to more like 85. Actually, no, billionaire healthcare is quite bad because no one says no. So say they live to 70. That's 50, that's 40 years. So they say you have like 40 to 50 years of economic significance. If the rich can get richer within 50 years so fast that you can go from being like a millionaire to being a trillionaire in 50 years, that's too fast. The government should not allow that kind of acceleration in theory, or it
It
should
might actually
heavily
be
cripple the possibility of that. If
it
that
might
happens,
actually
it
be
should be enigmatic.
it might be the fault of the government through inflation, because the one interesting thing is right now our stock market is at all-time highs. It's not all-time highs necessarily because those companies grew in value. It's at all-time highs.
The number went up because someone said the number goes up.
Yes, exactly. The more dollars in circulation, the less they're worth. Therefore, a billion turns into a trillion pretty fast.
Mm, I see what you're saying.
So there's certain of guardrails that have to go onto the government, and there's easy ones that you could do for the billionaires because you want to tax them. Fine. One of the tricks that they do, not tricks, I guess you could say it's a trick, is that they will put up shares of their company as collateral to borrow against with a bank, right? So then they will borrow, say, $100 million from a bank to build some houses and yachts and whatever, and then they'll pay that back.
Unrealized value.
Right, and then they'll pay that back, but they won't have to pay taxes because it's a debt.
Mm.
And so they'll have this free money that they will make back over time without having to pay taxes on it. Now, you could place a fair value tax that's at 10% on whatever that over a certain amount is, and that wouldn't force them to sell their stocks like in the previous one. It would still gain tax revenue, and they'd still be able to have their houses and their yachts or whatever. But
Yeah.
that's a fair way to take care of the loophole that they've been using.
So this is actually a perfect segue into the thing that I wanted to bring up a little earlier,
It's
which is a conversation I think we've had before. But I was having a conversation with a friend of mine over Discord. I met him when I was playing a game called Albion Online, which is somewhat well known as a sandbox MMO for having a very good like market system where you have these 5 separate cities that all have separate marketplaces, and each of those cities is designated for having production like bonuses and access to different resources that the ability to refine and use those resources is located in a different city, and there's like full loop PvP zones and stuff between them and stuff like that that makes it, and I'm summarizing a little bit, that's not fully accurate, but it basically makes it so that you want to take resources that you gather in one area, and then you want to take them somewhere else to sell them, or take them somewhere else to refine them, and then take them somewhere else to sell them. And so there's a lot of merchant gameplay in Albion, and I met him there because I had some history. I got picked up by an RMT guild at one point, unbeknownst to me, that said they were going to hire me to make content, and that didn't work out. But I ended up learning a lot about that game and a lot about how to play that game to make money, and then I realized that my guildmates were selling the money for money. Okay, Anyway, moving on, some years later, I started playing and I met this other guild and I broke off of that guild with a couple of the guys in there because the guild master was weird. Anyway, so fast forward, I was talking to one of these guys. He's like a big old school MMO type guy. And, I had brought up to him, like, for a lot of these games, it doesn't feel like there is any inherent reason to use crypto as an in-game currency rather than just gold. Like, it doesn't do anything favorable, especially since developers can't even make gold, a thing that you can't remove from the market and exchange for dollars. People can't, like, developers can't even make gold have a stable value. Oh, and you still have RMTers coming and doing the same thing with that shit. It inflates pretty universally. And I was talking to him about, like, well, how do you prevent this? You've got a couple of different ways you can do this. And I had just had a conversation with you about your inflationary, your deflationary, and your stable systems and the ideal of creating the stable system. But with a video game, it's kind of hard to do that because when you kill a goblin, the goblin is supposed to have 5 gold. What happens when a person kills 50,000 goblins and now they have big money? Now they have all of that gold. And what if they just choose not to spend it? And now they have all this gold, and if there's only so much gold to go around, eventually goblins will start to only have 4 gold because there just won't be gold left, right? And this is a thing that some of the crypto games have been trying to tackle with, like, okay, there's X amount of money and it exhausts over the course of a day, maybe. And then whenever players do market trading, there's like a tax on the trades, and that money goes back into the pool, which then gets put back into monster drops and stuff like that. But it's like, yeah, but you can't stop a player from saying, thank you for all of those monster drops. I'm going to take them off onto the central exchange and exchange them for USD doll hairs. And now I have completely circumvented the system that's supposed to keep the in-game thing running correctly because I'm just taking it to the bank. And that's an issue.
Always game the system.
Exactly, because
Always game the system.
people are always going to do what's optimal for their wallet if they are in need of that. Some gamers will play game for game, and some gamers will see that game is better way to make money than gas station. So as long as the game offers any kind of, like, anything above a nominal amount of money as a gameplay reward, people are going to just remove it from the system. And slowly but surely, the value of playing the game drops, which is bad. So unless the company is in a perpetual state of growth where they can always go onto the market and just buy the money from the people who are taking it to the bank and put it back into the system themselves and just, like, constantly floor sweep, then it's always going to fail. So we were talking a little bit about, like, well, what can you do as a developer with just, like, gold in a closed system, not crypto at all? Like, what could you do? And he was saying, well, over time, the rich will get richer, right? Powerful players will get powerful, and you want the players maybe to have an in-game gold market economy, right? Now, Albion does something like this with items, where players craft all the items out of infinite resources, by the way. So the resources that get used to craft the items never exhaust, which is crazy insofar as creating things with value in theory. Because over time, the value of those things will go down because there's more of them. But the items get destroyed when people die. So that does fix that to a degree because the items take a lot of resources to make. So you are able to exhaust those things over time. Okay, so that helps to balance that with the resources. But when players sell things to the NPCs, those things get seeded back into the monster drop item pool and, like, the things that you can find in treasure chests. So one of the issues with that is that over time, with very old servers, if you go into a legendary dungeon, you'll find fewer items in chests, and the value of the stuff in the chests will be lower than a very, like, newly
Fun up server that has
yeah, a
like
very
new
newly spun
instance
up
of the
server
game.
that's like going well. Not like a brand new server because no one will have crafted any items yet, so there won't be anything to put in the chests. But like a newly like booming server is going to be at its peak. But there will be a peak and there will be a valley. And that's kind of rough. So what he suggested as a way to sort of maintain the stability of gold and to stop people from hoarding it, because we were at the time discussing having a finite amount of gold. And I was like, okay, you have a finite amount of gold. Awesome. So there's only 1,000 gold in the world. What happens when one player gets 50 of that gold and then he continues to play and he just doesn't spend it? Well, you need to give him things to spend it on. Well, yeah, but what if he holds off and he waits until he accumulates more and more of that gold until suddenly this guy has 500 gold? He has half of the gold in the entire economy just because fuck everyone else. It doesn't benefit him in any way, but what it does do is it makes him more influential for anything social whatsoever. He gets to determine the value of items on the market because he's the one with the money. He gets to buy the best things because he's the one with the money. And the rich get richer, right? So this player who decides to just do this expression of free will and hoard all the money, definitely not Elon Musk, does massively rock the boat of how the rest of the economy works because now not even the monsters have money. So no one can get money anywhere because all of the money is in one place. So what do you do to deal with this? And he suggests, well, have a holding tax above a certain amount of money. Kind of like
That's very similar to what Elizabeth Warren.
well, right. And so we actually ended up talking about this at one point because I'd brought this up to you. But in a video game, a holding tax is actually fine because as a player in a game that is run by developers, if the player spends the money on assets, you can determine whether or not that player can turn those assets back into gold or not, and at what rate they will do so. You'll notice that a lot of times when you are a player and you pick up a rusty axe off of some dead enemy and you go to sell that to a vendor, the vendor pays you 9 gold for it, and then you want to buy a rusty axe from a vendor and it's like 90 gold. So what? They sell it back to you at a 10x markup. Like and the developer gets to choose that that's how that works, right? So you will always be sinking gold into the developer's bank that gets put back through the economic system. And whenever you try to get gold from them, it's inherently more difficult, right? And at a lower rate. So there are ways that you can do that as like when you're running a game economy. Right, and that holding tax thing, there's no issue with that because you're not taxing people's unrealized assets, you're not taxing people's sword, you're taxing people's held money. So because what you're specifically trying to do is you're trying to discourage people from hoarding the actual money. So you say, okay, if you have more than 100 gold, everything over 100 gold gets taxed at 5% per week.
What you just described as inflation. Because if the value of the money goes down, it's inherently a tax. So the value of the gold, so it's encouraging people to spend it instead
Yeah.
of hold it. So
Right.
the value will go down otherwise, and it'll go to nothing. So it's more beneficial to spend it and then get other assets that will hold the value.
Exactly.
So it's kind of like a God-induced in type of inflation tax, even though the value or the number of the asset isn't increasing, it's a kind of like that. It's a bit like that.
Yeah. And so when I brought that up to you, and I was like, okay, well, this is what we determined about a stable in-game economy with X amount of currency units, is that a holding tax could encourage gamers to spend their money on power gains and on in-game items that hold the value rather than have the value slowly bleed. Sort of like holding water in your hands. Is it like what you want to do as a player is you want to play and get a full cupped handful of water, but you want to drink that water as fast as you can before it slips through your fingers. That's really the system that we were encouraging when we were theorizing this like MMO economy. The problem with doing that with people is that people are going to want their exchanging their money into power gains as you would do in a video game, or in this case, assets that would hold their value. They're going to want that value to be safe there. But in a video game, you can decide that when they do that, they can't turn it back into money. In real life, that's not how it works. People want to be able to turn that back into more money, if
Right.
anything.
Essentially, what
But
the
you
game's
can't.
doing is it's incentivizing people to invest that holding money into other assets that would have more value. And like you're saying, in the real world, people would turn that back into money, and that's essentially how markets work. That's how markets are manipulated. Is
Right.
evenly.
So what you had suggested at the time was, instead of telling people that their money is going to be taxed, because that's just going to encourage people to do what very rich people already do, which is to just put their money into things that hold their value,
Right.
or even grow that value. Um, Instead of doing that, or instead of trying to tax unrealized asset value, like the Elizabeth Warren proposition, which we already discussed why that wouldn't work, instead what you should do is you should try to gate or punish the mechanism by which people cheat on
Mhm.
taxes, which
Yeah.
isn't actually investment in assets, it's the loans that people get that are guaranteed by the assets they hold. So
Yep.
when people say that billionaire XYZ doesn't pay their taxes, they do actually. They just
Mhm.
don't have any income, and that's by design. They don't have any monetary income.
They definitely have a certain amount of monetary income. I mean, you could go back to Elon Musk and like tax him for sure. I think actually he paid the largest amount of taxes ever, like 11 billion a
I
few years ago.
believe
But he
that
had to
that is
sell.
true. I've heard
And
that.
I think he had to sell a bunch of stocks for that to happen for him to have that income. He still will have a certain amount of income, but he can choose however much income
He
he
can
needs.
choose how much that is,
Yeah.
and he can choose when it is as well.
Yep. Yep.
So what they will do is they will buy shares, or they will buy pyramids, whatever it is. Uh, Musical theater reference for anyone who gets that. But that's not dollars. That's stocks or buildings or businesses. Those are not dollars. So dollars are what are taxed in income in dollars. And so if you don't have income in dollars and you instead have assets, then you don't get taxed on those things. Those are not W-2able income.
Yeah. Yep. The
um,
property. Yep.
and so what gets taxed is if you have assets and then you sell them for dollars and then you get dollars for those assets. And now that is taxable income. But why would you do that if you're going to get taxed when you can instead just have value and you can say to someone, look, I have a house and you have something that I want. Give me the thing that I want for the house, and no one has to have any money enter the equation, so no one gets taxed. Or, more realistically, what actually happens is you have a thing that I want, and I don't have money, but give me 5 minutes. They go to a bank and they say, hey, bank, give me like $8 bajillion or whatever. I have like 25 houses that I'm good for it. You can tell because I have so many houses. And the bank's like, great, Mr. Not, definitely not Elon. We'll do you that $8 bajillion loan, no sweat. And so then he takes that $8 bajillion of debt that he has this money, but he also has that debt. So when he gets taxed, it's like that's losses. But now he has all this money that he can give to this person for that thing that he wants. So he has kind of infinite money. He's a billionaire with a finite amount of net worth, but he actually has infinite money because he has as much money as banks are willing to let him go into debt, which is endless, as it turns out. So what you would do, and what you'd suggested was instead what you have to do is you have to tax the loan game that they play.
Yep.
You have to
Yep.
say, okay, loans, and I thought about this a little bit. I was like, loans above a certain, maybe loans above a certain value, but then
Mhm.
it's like, well, no, because then the banks will play ball with them if that happens too. Is loans above a certain value get taxed at like 10% or whatever as just like a throwaway number. But then what they'll do is they'll take out loans that are $1 below that value,
Yep.
and then they won't get taxed at all. You know, so then it's like, okay, well, what about if you do uh total bank debt or total loan debt above a certain point? And it's just cumulative. It's not like individual loans get taxed. It's just like total loan debt, 10% tax. But then you're like, well, okay, what about the actual person, like how do you game that system? And I'm sure they would find a way eventually. but you'd at least get a few good years. And I think I've talked about this before, but basically, tax code just needs to continue to play cat and mouse. We stopped playing cat and mouse some years ago, but they just need to keep going after them to
Well,
fix the problem.
it needs to simplify and play cat and mouse all at the same
Yeah,
time.
yeah, the simplifying would be helpful at this point. But anyway,
I think that's it. Yeah.
circled back to the rant that I think I went off on last time anyway. So
Yeah. I think that's a great place to end off for now. We'll have to pick it up again because I think we both have a lot more to talk about. But again, Nigel, thanks so much for taking the time to sit down and chat with me and get people interested in crypto.